The notice arrived on a Tuesday, slipped beneath the front door of a rented apartment on the third floor of a building that smelled permanently of damp carpet and someone else's cooking. Mara found it when she came home from her second shift, still wearing the uniform from the diner, her shoes leaving faint salt prints on the linoleum floor. She picked it up without urgency. Notices had become routine over the past year, paper evidence of a life being slowly reclaimed by systems that had no interest in context or circumstance. This one, she assumed, would be the same. It was not. The letter was from the county assessor's office. It referenced a property she had never heard of, attached to an estate she had not known existed. Her mother's older sister, a woman Mara had met perhaps twice in her childhood, had died 11 months earlier. The estate had moved through probate quietly, without fanfare, and what remained after debts and legal fees was a single asset that no one else had wanted. A condemned church on the edge of a town called Kellerton, 3 hours inland, sitting on a plot of land that flooded each spring and baked each summer into something resembling hardpan. The transfer of title, the letter explained, was complete. The property was hers. The back taxes owed on it totaled $14.61. Mara read the letter twice at the kitchen table, her uniform still on, a glass of water untouched beside her hand. Then she set it down and looked at the wall for a long time without seeing it. She had 2 children. Her daughter was 9 and had recently been fitted for glasses that the insurance had only partially covered. Her son was 6 and had developed a persistent cough that a doctor had attributed to the mold in the apartment walls, the same mold the landlord had been promising to address for 7 months. She was 4 weeks behind on rent. Her car needed a timing belt it was not going to receive until the following paycheck, assuming the diner's weekend rush held steady. She had $43 in checking and a jar of coins on the dresser that she had been too tired to count. A condemned church 3 hours away was not a solution to any of this. It was, by any reasonable measure, an additional burden. Another thing requiring attention she did not have. Another cost she could not absorb. She folded the letter and put it in the drawer beside the stove, where she kept things that needed to be dealt with eventually. She went to bed. She did not sleep well. Over the following 2 weeks, the letter stayed in the drawer. Life continued in its compressed and pressurized way. The landlord raised the rent. The timing belt made a sound it had not made before. Her daughter's teacher sent a note home about a field trip that required $20 by Friday. Mara worked the morning shift, the split shift, the double when it was offered. She smiled at tables and carried plates and refilled coffee and thanked people for tips that ranged from generous to insulting, and she kept the numbers in her head the way she always had, running a constant quiet arithmetic that never fully balanced. But the letter did not leave her. She thought about it in the in-between moments, in the car waiting for a light to change, in the break room when no one else was there, in the dark before her daughter's breathing evening out beside her told her the children were finally asleep. A church, condemned, $14.61. She did not know what she was looking for when she finally typed the address in her phone. She told herself she was simply gathering information, that knowing something was not the same as deciding anything. The satellite image that loaded showed a stone building surrounded by overgrown grass, its roof visibly compromised at one corner. A section of the front steps crumbled away. The church sat on a slight rise above what appeared to be a low-lying field, and behind it, partially obscured by trees, was a second, smaller structure she could not identify. The whole scene had the quality of something that had been waiting a very long time for attention that had not come. She zoomed in on the main building. The stone walls appeared intact. Whatever damage existed seemed concentrated at the roof and the entrance. The windows were boarded. The steeple leaned slightly in a way that might have been the camera angle or might not have been. There was nothing about the image that recommended the property as anything other than what it appeared to be a liability dressed in old stone. She closed the phone. She opened it again. She stared at the address. She called her neighbor the next morning, a retired woman named Dolores who watched the children on school holidays in exchange for Mara's help with groceries once a month, and asked if she could keep them for a Saturday. Dolores asked no questions. She had known Mara long enough to understand that explanations were offered when there was energy for them. The drive took 2 hours and 50 minutes. Mara left before sunrise, a thermos of coffee in the cup holder and a printout of directions on the passenger seat, because she did not trust the signal once she cleared the highway. The landscape changed slowly as she drove inland, becoming flatter, then more rolling, then settling into the kind of country that had once supported a different economy and now sustained what remained of it without complaint. Small towns appeared and receded. Gas stations with single pumps. Grain elevators standing at distances. Fields that went on without apology. Kellerton announced itself with a water tower and a speed limit sign. The main street had a hardware store, a diner, a post office, and 3 buildings that had once been businesses and were now simply structures waiting for purpose. The church was not on the main street. It was at the end of a road that climbed slightly out of the town center before leveling off and continuing toward the tree line. Mara found it without difficulty. It was exactly where the satellite image had placed it, and it looked exactly as she had expected, except that in person, the scale of it was different. The church was larger than she had imagined. The stone walls rose to a height that seemed disproportionate to the surrounding landscape, as if the building had been designed to assert something against the flatness of the sky. The wood of the window boards had weathered to a silver gray that almost matched the stone in certain light. The double doors at the front were secured with a chain that had rusted into a single immovable piece. The steps leading up to them had partially collapsed, the middle section giving way and leaving a gap that required careful stepping around. Mara stood at the base of the rise for a long moment, looking up at the building. The morning was quiet except for wind moving through the tall grass and the distant sound of something agricultural she could not place. There were no other cars on the road. No signs of recent activity near the property. The grass around the church had not been cut in what appeared to be years, and it had grown tall enough in places to obscure the lower portions of the foundation. She climbed the rise carefully, avoiding the broken section of steps, and pressed her palm flat against the stone wall beside the door. The surface was cool and slightly rough, grained by weather but solid beneath her hand in a way that was difficult to explain as anything other than enduring. She walked the perimeter slowly, pushing through the high grass with her forearms, looking at the foundation, the walls, the window boards. The roof damage she had seen in the image was worse up close. A section above, what would have been the apse, had partially collapsed inward, and she could see daylight where the rafters had given way. But the walls themselves showed no cracking, no bowing, no signs of the kind of structural failure that made buildings dangerous to enter. At the rear of the church, she found the secondary structure she had noticed in the satellite image. It was low to the ground and built of the same stone, connected to the main building by a short covered passage that was largely intact. The door to this structure was wood, swollen in its frame from moisture, but not locked. She pushed it open with her shoulder and found herself in a narrow vestibule that smelled of earth and something older beneath it that she could not name. The floor was flagstone, cold even through her shoes. The walls were bare stone without plaster. A single window, too high and too narrow to admit much light, let in a gray bar of morning that barely reached the floor. She stood there for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. The room was empty of furniture. There were hooks on one wall, where something had once hung, their iron darkened to the color of dried blood. At the far end of the vestibule was another door, this one shorter and set deeper into the wall, its frame fitted with a thickness that suggested deliberate construction rather than architectural afterthought. Mara tried the handle. It turned. The door opened inward, slowly, resisting slightly at the base where the stone floor had shifted by perhaps a centimeter over decades of settling. Beyond it was a set of stairs descending into darkness. She stood at the top of those stairs for a long time. She was not afraid of the dark. She had grown up in houses where the electricity was sometimes off long enough to require candles and had developed an early comfort with darkness that most people she knew did not share. What held her at the top of the stairs was not fear, but a quality of the air rising from below, cool and still, and carrying a faint mineral weight that pressed against her face like a hand not pushing but present. She took out her phone, turned on a flashlight, and descended. The stairs were stone, 12 of them, each tread worn slightly concave in its center in a way that spoke of very long use. The walls on either side were close enough that she could have touched both simultaneously with her elbows. The ceiling was low. At the bottom, she stepped off the last stair and swept the light around her. The crypt was not large. It was a single rectangular space, perhaps 20 feet by 30, with a vaulted ceiling that rose to perhaps 8 feet at its apex. The floor was flagstone, the same as above, but laid with greater precision, the joints between stones tight and even. The walls were stone as well, rough cut but fitted carefully, without mortar in some sections, and with an older, lime-based mortar in others that had dried to the color of bone. Along the walls on either side were alcoves, each one roughly 2 feet wide and 3 feet deep, set into the stone at regular intervals. Some were empty. Others contained stone boxes, rectangular and flat-lidded, their surfaces plain without inscription. At the far end of the crypt, the wall was solid stone without alcoves, and, at its base, where the flagstone floor met the wall, there was a slight protrusion she might have missed entirely if the angle of the light had not caught it. She crossed the room slowly, aware of the weight of the building above her. The way the silence here was different from the silence outside, more complete, as if the stone had been absorbing sound for so long it had forgotten how to release it. Her footsteps were muffled, barely audible, absorbed by the density of the space before they could echo. She crouched at the far wall and ran the light along the base. The protrusion was a raised section of flagstone, perhaps 12 inches square, its surface slightly different in color from the surrounding floor. The stone itself was the same type, but it sat higher by perhaps half an inch, and its edges were sharper, less worn than the stones around it. She pressed the toe of her shoe against it. It did not move. She pressed harder. Nothing. She sat back on her heels and studied it. The difference in where was the detail that stayed with her. Every other stone in the floor had been smoothed by time and foot traffic until its surface had taken on a soft, almost polished quality in certain areas. This one had not. Its edges were still crisp, which meant it had not been walked on, which meant it had not been there as long as the others, but had been placed there deliberately to cover something beneath. Mara did not touch it further. She photographed it from multiple angles with her phone. She photographed the alcoves, the sealed stone boxes, the vaulted ceiling, the stairs. She photographed the door at the top of the stairs, the vestibule, the iron hooks on the wall. She documented the passage connecting the vestibule to the main building, the state of the roof visible through the collapsed section, the chain on the front doors, the condition of the steps. Then she climbed back into the morning light and stood outside with her hand shielding her eyes and thought about what $14.61 had purchased. She drove back to the town center and found the diner, which was open and served coffee in mugs that had seen decades of handling. She sat at the counter, and the woman who brought her coffee had the kind of face that belonged to someone who had lived in a place long enough to know everything about it without having been asked. Mara asked about the church. The woman set down the coffee pot and leaned against the counter and thought about the question as if it deserved genuine consideration. St. Aldrich's, she said. It had been closed since the diocese consolidated the parishes sometime in the early 90s. Before that, it had been active for a very long time. She believed since the middle of the 19th century. The building was old, older than most things in Kellerton, built by the original settlers of the area who had come from somewhere in Central Europe and brought their building methods with them. The stone had been quarried locally. Mara asked about the crypt. The woman's expression shifted slightly, not with alarm, but with a recognition that the question was more specific than casual curiosity. She said that the crypt was known locally but not widely discussed. The church had served the community for generations, and the crypt had been used for its original purpose for much of that time. There were families in Kellerton whose ancestors were interred there. When the church closed, the diocese had arranged for some remains to be transferred to the municipal cemetery. Others had stayed, she believed, because families could not be located or had not responded to the notifications. Mara asked if anyone had been inside the crypt recently. The woman said, "Not that she was aware of." The property had been privately held for the past several years after the diocese sold it, but whoever had held the title had done nothing with it and apparently paid little attention to it. She looked at Mara with a directness that was not unfriendly, but was clearly curious. Mara told her she had inherited the property. There was a pause. The woman refilled her coffee without being asked. She said, carefully and without inflection, that the church had a history and that histories in small towns tended to be more complicated than they appeared from the outside. She did not elaborate. She brought Mara a piece of pie she had not ordered and said it was on the house. Mara ate the pie and thought about the stone in the crypt floor. She called her neighbor Dolores from the parking lot before she drove home. The children were fine, Dolores said. Her son had eaten 2 bowls of oatmeal, and her daughter had spent the morning reading. Mara thanked her and sat in the car a moment longer before starting it. She had not yet decided anything. She told herself this as she pulled back onto the road that would eventually become the highway that would eventually return her to the apartment with the mold in the walls and the jar of coins on the dresser. She had inherited a condemned church. She had seen a crypt. She had seen a stone in the floor that did not match the others. These were observations, not decisions. She was a practical person. She did not have the capacity for impractical decisions. She was 40 miles from home when she turned around. It took her a while to find what she was looking for. The county records office was a low brick building beside the courthouse that was open until noon on Saturdays, which gave her just under an hour. The clerk who helped her was a young man who moved through the filing system with the particular efficiency of someone who had memorized it through repetition rather than interest. She asked for records on the St. Aldrich's property, everything available, historical through current. What he brought her was 3 folders and an apology for the condition of the oldest materials. She sat at a table in the corner and worked through them quickly. The most recent folder contained the chain of title for the past 40 years, routine transfers, and a period of diocesan ownership, followed by the private sale, and then the estate transfer that had landed the property in her hands. The second folder contained older municipal records, inspection reports, a zoning variance from the 1960s, and a reference to a structural assessment from 1989 that had noted the roof as a concern. Nothing remarkable. The third folder was the one that held her attention. The documents were older, some of them typed on paper that had gone brittle at the edges, others handwritten in a formal script that was difficult but not impossible to read. They covered the period of the church's construction and early history, and they had been compiled at some point, she guessed, by a local historian or an archivist who had gathered everything relevant into a single collection. There were letters between the founding congregation and the diocese, construction records listing materials and costs, a deed of land transfer from 1853, and a document she had to read twice before she understood what it described. It was a receipt, or something functioning as one, dated 1891, written in 2 languages, one of which was English and one of which she did not recognize but thought might be Czech or Slovak. It referenced a delivery to the property, described only as materials for permanent safekeeping, and it was signed by 2 men, one of whom was identified as the church's founding deacon, and one of whom bore a title she had to look up on her phone because she did not recognize it. The title, when she found its translation, belonged to a regional treasury official of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Mara set the paper down on the table and pressed her fingertips against it lightly, the way she had pressed her palm against the stone wall of the church that morning, feeling for solidity. She photographed every page in the folder with her phone. She thanked the clerk. She drove home. That night, after the children were in bed and the apartment was quiet, she sat at the kitchen table with her phone and worked through what she had photographed. She was not an expert in any relevant field. She could not read the second language in the receipt. She did not know the history of the Austro-Hungarian Empire beyond the broad strokes she had absorbed from school and occasional reading. She did not know what a regional treasury official might have delivered to a small church in the American Midwest in 1891, or why such a delivery would be described in terms that implied permanence rather than temporary storage. But she knew what a raised stone in a crypt floor looked like when it had been placed there recently enough that its edges had not yet worn smooth. She opened the drawer beside the stove and took out the original letter from the county assessor's office. She read it again, slowly. Then she folded it and held it between her hands and looked out the window at the dark. She thought about her daughter's glasses. She thought about the mold in the walls. She thought about the timing belt and the $20 for the field trip and the jar of coins on the dresser and the 4 weeks of rent she still owed. She thought about what it meant to inherit something that everyone else had looked at and walked away from. And she thought about the woman at the diner who had brought her pie she had not ordered and said that histories in small towns tended to be more complicated than they appeared. She thought about the stone in the floor. She did not make a decision that night, at least not in the formal sense. Not in the way she made decisions about the children's school schedules or which bills to pay first when the numbers were too close to call. What she did instead was quieter than a decision. She simply stopped telling herself that she was not going to go back. The second visit happened the following weekend. This time she brought her toolbox, a lantern with fresh batteries, a notebook, and a thermos that was larger than the first one. She also brought a thin pry bar that she had owned for years and used occasionally for small home repairs. She told herself she was not going to use it. She brought it anyway. The church was the same as she had left it. The grass had not been cut. The chain on the door had not been touched. The boarded windows stood in their silver gray patience. She went directly to the rear of the building, through the vestibule, down the 12 worn stairs into the crypt. The lantern changed the space. In the broad, steady light it cast, the crypt lost some of the atmospheric weight it had carried by phone flashlight and became something more specific, more examinable. She could see detail she had missed before. The alcoves were not uniformly distributed. On the left wall there were 6 of them, evenly spaced. On the right wall there were 5, with a slightly larger gap between the third and fourth that might have indicated a 6th alcove that had never been cut or had been filled. The sealed stone boxes occupied 3 of the left alcoves and 2 of the right. The others were empty. She spent time with the boxes first, not opening them, but examining the lids. They were plain, without inscription, which was unusual for burial containers of this age. Normally, even modest interments carried a name, a date, a designation of some kind. The absence of marking on these boxes was either a sign of very old practice predating certain customs, or a sign that these were not what they appeared to be. She photographed each one and made notes on dimensions and condition in her notebook. Then she went to the far wall and crouched again beside the raised stone. Up close and in the better light, she could see what she had not fully registered the first time. Around the perimeter of the raised section, the mortar joint was newer than the surrounding joints. Not dramatically so. The color difference was subtle, a slightly lighter gray, less weathered. But it was there. Someone had reseeded this stone within the past few decades, not centuries. The precision of the replacement was good, but not perfect, and the slight unevenness at one corner, where the stone's edge sat perhaps a millimeter above the neighboring piece, was the kind of detail that only revealed itself under careful, close examination. Mara took out the pry bar. She held it for a moment, her thumbnail running along the flat edge. She thought about the receipt in the records office. She thought about materials for permanent safekeeping. She thought about a treasury official from a collapsed empire standing in this crypt in 1891 and deciding that whatever he had brought with him needed to stay. She placed the flat edge of the pry bar against the corner where the mortar joint was slightly raised and applied careful, measured pressure. The stone resisted for a moment, then gave a faint sound, not a crack, but a release, the sound of a seal broken that had been meant to hold. She worked the bar gently around the perimeter, loosening the joint without forcing it. Dust rose in a fine pale cloud and settled on her hands and knees. The stone moved slightly, a millimeter, then 2. She adjusted her grip and lifted. The stone came free. It was heavier than it looked, cut thick, perhaps 4 inches of solid flagstone. She set it carefully to one side and directed the lantern into the space beneath. There was a hollow, roughly 2 feet square and perhaps 18 inches deep. Its interior walls were smooth, plastered in the old lime method, sealed against moisture. The space was dry. The air rising from it was cold and carried the same mineral weight she had noticed when she first descended the stairs, compressed and still, the breath of something long enclosed. Inside the hollow, arranged with a deliberateness that left no room for accident, were objects wrapped in heavy oilcloth that had darkened with age but remained intact. They were not stacked carelessly. They had been placed with attention, each piece oriented in a specific way, some wrapped individually and some grouped, the whole arrangement suggesting a mind that was organizing not just for storage but for eventual retrieval. Mara sat back on the cold flagstone floor and looked at what lay in the hollow beneath her. The lantern cast steady light. The crypt was silent. Above her, the old stone walls of the church held the sky at a distance, and somewhere in those walls was a history she had not yet fully read, and beneath her hands was the beginning of what that history had been keeping. She did not reach into the hollow. Not yet. She sat with it for a long time, the way she had learned to sit with difficult things, not avoiding them, not rushing them, but giving them the space they required before she decided what to do next. The children were at Dolores's again. The diner did not need her until Monday. The timing belt was still failing, but had not yet failed. She had come this far on $14.61 and an inheritance no one else had wanted. She reached into the hollow and carefully lifted the first wrapped piece. It was heavier than she expected. The oilcloth shifted in her hands, firm and yielding at once, the kind of weight that had density rather than bulk. She set it gently on the flagstone floor beside her and looked at the wrapping. The cloth was folded with precision, its edges tucked in a specific pattern she would later learn was associated with a particular method of protecting metal objects during long-term storage. She turned it over once, reading the shape with her hands before she unwrapped it. Then she unfolded the cloth. The object inside was a rectangular bar, approximately 9 inches long and 2 inches wide, its surface dark with a patina that was not tarnish but age, a deep mellow darkness that absorbed the lantern light rather than reflecting it. Along one face, she could make out markings pressed into the surface, letters and numbers, a series of symbols she did not recognize, and a stamp in the shape of a double-headed eagle. Mara stared at it. She turned it in her hands. It was the temperature of the stone, cool and indifferent, with no interest in the hands that held it. She set it carefully on the floor and reached back into the hollow. There were more. She counted them before she unwrapped any more. There were 11 pieces in total, each one wrapped in the same heavy oilcloth, each one resting in the hollow with the same careful orientation as the first. She did not disturb the arrangement further. She set the unwrapped bar back into its position, folded the cloth back around it with hands that were steadier than she expected, and replaced it exactly where it had been. Then she sat back and looked at the hollow for a long time without touching anything. The double-headed eagle. She had seen that symbol once before, or something close to it, on a coin in a glass case at a museum she had taken the children to the previous spring. The exhibit had been about European empires, and the coin had been Austro-Hungarian, 19th century, pressed with the same two-headed bird she had just seen stamped into a gold bar in a crypt beneath a condemned church in a town 3 hours from home. She was not going to pretend she did not know what gold looked like. The bar was gold. The color beneath the patina was unmistakable, a warmth that no other metal carried, that absorbed light differently, that sat in the hands with a particular gravity. She had held gold exactly once before, a thin chain belonging to her mother that had been pawned during a difficult year and never recovered. She recognized what she was holding the same way you recognize the smell of your childhood home, instantly and without argument. She replaced the stone. She worked the pry bar in reverse, pressing the flagstone back into the hollow, tamping the edges with her palm until it sat flush. The mortar joint would not hold perfectly. She had broken the seal, but she smoothed the loose material back into the gap with her finger, and it looked in the lantern light close enough to what it had been before. She climbed the stairs, walked back through the vestibule, and stood outside in the afternoon sun for several minutes, breathing. The drive home took longer than usual because she stopped twice. The first time she pulled into a gas station and sat in the car for 15 minutes without getting out. The second time, she pulled into a rest area and sat until her hands stopped doing the thing they had been doing, which was a fine, barely perceptible trembling that she did not associate with fear, but with a recalibration her body was performing without her permission. She had found something. She did not know yet what finding it meant or what it would cost her or demand of her. She only knew that she had found it, and that the finding was real, and that she was going to have to be very careful about what she did next. She did not tell anyone that night. She sat with the children through dinner and helped with homework and read the bedtime chapter they were in the middle of and turned out the light and stood in the hallway for a moment listening to the apartment settle around her. Then she went to the kitchen and opened her laptop and began to research. She started with the symbol. The double-headed eagle of the Austro-Hungarian Empire was well documented, its variants and applications cataloged in multiple academic sources. It had appeared on coinage, on official seals, on military insignia, and on the markings of the imperial treasury. Gold reserves held by the empire had been stamped with institutional seals that included the eagle, the serial number of the bar, and the weight in the measurement system of the time. She found photographs of authenticated bars in museum collections and in the records of international precious metals institutes. The format of the marking she had seen matched those photographs precisely. She read about the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which had occurred in 1918 following the First World War. The dissolution had been rapid and chaotic, its treasury divided, disputed, and in many cases simply lost. Significant reserves of gold and silver had been moved in the years preceding the collapse, some officially transferred to successor states, others relocated by officials acting on their own authority as the political situation deteriorated. Historians had documented numerous cases of imperial assets that had vanished from official records in the period between 1914 and 1922 and never been fully accounted for. She read for 3 hours. She made notes in a spiral notebook she kept for grocery lists and bill calculations, the same notebook where she tracked the children's school dates and the oil change schedule for the car. She wrote carefully, checking dates and sources, building a framework around what she had found. The receipt from the county records office placed the delivery in 1891, which meant the gold had arrived at the church 23 years before the empire's collapse. It had been brought there by a treasury official, which meant it was not a private fortune hidden by a single individual. It had come from an institution. It had been placed with intention by someone with the authority to move imperial assets into a church in a small Midwestern town built by immigrants from the empire's territory. The question she could not yet answer was why. She fell asleep at the kitchen table with her laptop open and woke at 4 a.m. to her son standing beside her asking for water. She gave him the water, carried him back to bed, and did not sleep again. The following week was the longest of her recent memory. She worked her shifts, made the children's lunches, paid what bills she could, and thought about the crypt with the consistency of someone trying not to think about something. She needed help. She knew this. She could not authenticate what she had found on her own, could not establish its provenance or its legal status or its value without expertise she did not possess. But she also understood that the moment she told anyone, the situation would expand beyond her ability to control it, and she had no assurance that expansion would move in her favor. She thought about Bernard Thorne, the farmer who had struck concrete in his field and watched his discovery be surrounded by barriers and managed by officials who thanked him for his cooperation while deciding his fate. She thought about what it meant to own something that others wanted access to, and how quickly ownership could be reclassified when powerful interests arrived. She was a woman with $43 in checking, a condemned church, and 11 gold bars in a crypt beneath the floor. She did not have the resources to fight a legal battle. She did not have connections to institutions that might advocate for her. What she had was the deed to the property, the receipt from the county records office, and the knowledge of what she had found before anyone else did. She decided to be deliberate. She found an attorney through the county legal aid office, a woman named Patricia Voss who worked primarily on property and estate matters and who had a reputation, the receptionist said, for being thorough. Mara made an appointment for the following Thursday. She did not explain what the appointment was about beyond property inheritance questions. In the days before the appointment, she returned to the records office and obtained certified copies of everything she had photographed: the deed, the historical documents, the receipt. She had them notarized. She kept the originals in a folder and made 2 additional copies, one of which she mailed to herself by a certified post and did not open. She also obtained a formal title confirmation from the county, verifying that the property, including all structures and their contents, was legally in her name. The appointment with Patricia Voss lasted 90 minutes. Mara explained the situation in sequence, beginning with the letter from the assessor's office and ending with a hollow beneath the crypt floor. She placed the certified documents on the desk between them as she spoke. She was specific about details and careful about language. She said she had found what appeared to be gold bars bearing the markings of the Austro-Hungarian imperial treasury. She said she had replaced them exactly as she had found them. She said she wanted to understand her legal position before taking any further action. Patricia Voss listened without interruption. She asked questions that were precise and unsentimental. She reviewed the documents with a concentration that told Mara she understood their significance. When she was finished, she set the papers down and looked at Mara with an expression that was not excitement, but its quieter cousin, professional recognition of an unusual situation. She said that under the laws of the state, objects found on privately owned land generally became the property of a landowner, unless they could be claimed by a prior owner with established legal standing. She said the dissolution of the Austro-Hungarian Empire over a century ago, with no successor state having filed a specific claim on these assets, placed the legal landscape in Mara's favor, but that it was not simple. She said the value involved, once established, would attract attention from multiple directions, some legitimate, some less so, and that Mara's best protection was documentation, patience, and the avoidance of any action that could be characterized as concealment or removal without proper process. She recommended engaging an independent appraiser before any public disclosure. She recommended filing a formal declaration of found property with the county. She recommended saying nothing to anyone until those steps were complete. Mara asked how long the process would take. Patricia Voss said, carefully, that it depended on what the appraisal revealed. 2 weeks later, a man named Gerald Okafor arrived in Kellerton on a Thursday morning. He was a certified appraiser with 30 years of experience in precious metals and historical artifacts, and Patricia Voss had identified him as someone whose reputation for discretion was as established as his professional credentials. Mara had told no one else about the appointment. She met him at the church herself, with the lantern and the pry bar and the notebook she had been adding to steadily since the first visit. Gerald Okafor descended the stairs into the crypt without visible reaction to the space. He had, Mara gathered, been in unusual places before. He moved through the crypt methodically, examining the alcoves and the sealed stone boxes before Mara led him to the far wall and lifted the stone. He crouched beside the hollow for a long time. He wore latex gloves and carried a small kit that contained tools she did not know the names of and a handheld device he referred to as a spectrometer. He lifted each wrapped piece from the hollow, unwrapped it with the same folded corner precision the original packer had used, and examined it under a focused penlight before placing it on a cloth he had spread on the flagstone floor. He did not speak while he worked. Mara sat on the stairs and watched. The crypt was cold and absolutely still. The lantern cast its broad, untroubled light across the stone walls and the vaulted ceiling and the cloth on the floor where the bars lay in a row, their surfaces dark and warm and indifferent. When all 11 pieces had been examined, Gerald Okafor ran the spectrometer across each one. The device made no sound. He read the display and wrote in his own notebook. He photographed each bar from multiple angles with a camera that was not a phone. He examined the stampings with a loupe, spending particular time on the serial numbers and the eagle seal, comparing them to photographs he pulled up on a tablet he had brought in his kit. He rewrapped each bar in its original cloth and replaced them in the hollow in the same arrangement. When the stone was replaced and the floor looked as it had before, he stood and removed his gloves and looked at Mara. He said the bars were consistent with Austro-Hungarian imperial treasury gold, minted between approximately 1880 and 1895 based on the serial number range and stamp design. He said the spectrometer confirmed a gold content consistent with imperial standard, which was historically very high purity. He said the weight of each bar, based on his handling, was consistent with the standard imperial measure of the period, which he confirmed by calculation in his notebook. He said 11 bars at that weight and purity represented a quantity that had not been on any publicly known inventory of recovered imperial assets. He said he would need to complete his written report before providing a formal figure, but he was willing to give her an informal range. He told her the range. Mara heard it and did not react visibly. She thanked him. She climbed the stairs out of the crypt and walked through the vestibule and out into the afternoon, which had turned cold while they were underground. She stood in the churchyard in the tall grass with her hands in her pockets and looked out at the flat landscape and the low sky and the distant water tower of Kellerton visible between the trees. The range Gerald Okafor had described, expressed in current market values for gold of that purity, began at $4 million and extended, depending on the historical provenance premium that might apply to authenticated imperial treasury pieces, to something considerably higher. The bars were not merely bullion. They were historical artifacts with documentation that could be traced, and in the market for such objects, documentation multiplied value in ways that simple weight calculations did not capture. She stood in the churchyard for a long time. She thought about the apartment with the mold in the walls. She thought about her son's cough and her daughter's glasses. She thought about the jar of coins on the dresser and the timing belt and the 4 weeks of rent and the $20 for the field trip she had eventually managed by skipping lunch for 3 days. She thought about the counter at the diner and the particular quality of the silence that existed in the break room at 2 in the afternoon when everyone else had gone back out, and she was alone with her numbers and her tiredness. She thought about $14.61. Then she called Patricia Voss. The formal declaration of found property was filed with the county the following Monday. Patricia Voss handled the paperwork with the same thorough quietness she had brought to every step of the process. The filing was a matter of public record, which meant it was accessible, which meant that the period of complete privacy Mara had operated in was now technically over. Patricia had explained this clearly. The declaration was protection, not secrecy. It established the timeline, confirmed ownership, and created an official record that would be difficult to challenge retroactively. The trade-off was that the record existed. Anyone who looked for it could find it. For 4 days, no. One did. On the 5th day, a man Mara did not recognize appeared at the edge of the church property while she was there for a follow-up meeting with Gerald Okafor. He stood at the bottom of the rise, his hands in his pockets, looking at the building with the specific attentiveness of someone who is assessing rather than admiring. Mara watched him from the vestibule doorway. He did not approach. After perhaps 10 minutes, he got into a car parked at the road's edge and drove away. She mentioned it to Patricia Voss that evening. Patricia said it was likely a journalist. The county records were public, and there were people who monitored new filings for unusual entries. A found property declaration involving a historical church in a small town was the kind of thing that attracted early, quiet attention before it attracted the louder kind. She advised Mara to be prepared. Mara went home and cooked dinner and helped with homework and read the bedtime chapter and stood in the hallway afterward listening to the apartment. Then she sat at the kitchen table and thought about what being prepared meant when he had spent the past several years being unprepared for almost everything and had survived it anyway through the application of stubbornness and arithmetic and the refusal to stop. The first person to say something directly was her sister. Mara had told her nothing, but something had reached her through the particular channels that family information traveled, imprecise and distorted but directional. She called on a Wednesday evening while Mara was doing dishes. She had heard, she said, that Mara had inherited some property. She had also heard, she said, from someone who had heard from someone in Kellerton that there was something on the property, something valuable. Mara said she had inherited a condemned church and was looking into what to do with it. Her sister said that sounded like a lot of trouble for something that was probably worthless. Mara said she thought so too. There was a pause. Her sister said that if Mara needed help with anything, any of the family would be glad to get involved. She said it in a warm, easy way, the kind of way that carried the implication that involvement was a gift being offered rather than a position being staked. Mara recognized the tone. She had heard it before at different times, around different situations where something that had been overlooked suddenly became worth noticing. She thanked her sister and said she would be in touch. The second person was a man from a property development company who called Patricia Voss's office 3 days after the declaration was filed. He had a friendly voice and a proposal. The company was interested in the Kellerton property for a restoration and development project. They were prepared to offer significantly above assessed value for an immediate sale, all cash, quick close. No complications. Patricia told him the property was not for sale and ended the call. She told Mara about it that afternoon and said she expected more of the same. The declaration had described found property without specifying its nature, but the legal language was specific enough that anyone familiar with property and heritage law could infer the category. People were paying attention now. The quiet was ending. What happened next moved faster than Mara had anticipated, not because she had been naive about the timeline, but because the machinery of institutional attention, once engaged, operated on its own schedule. Within 10 days of the filing, she received a letter from a historical preservation society requesting access to the property for assessment. 2 days after that, a professor from university 2 states away contacted Patricia Voss with questions about the provenance of the find. The County Historical Commission made an inquiry. A journalist from a regional newspaper made a second inquiry. Through all of it, Patricia Voss moved with a steadiness that Mara was deeply grateful for, answering what needed to be answered, deflecting what needed to be deflected, and reminding everyone who pressed that the property and its contents were privately owned, that the owner had followed every legal requirement, and that no access or information would be provided without proper process and the owner's explicit consent. Mara continued working her shifts at the diner. She continued making the children's lunches and helping with homework and reading the bedtime chapter. She continued running the arithmetic in her head, though the numbers she was calculating had changed their nature entirely, and she had not yet fully adjusted to what the new numbers meant. She had not touched the contents of the hollow again. Gerald Okafor's written report sat in a folder alongside the certified historical documents and the title confirmation and the mailed-to-herself copy that still sat unopened in its envelope. She had built a record. She had followed the process. She had done everything Patricia Voss had advised. What she had not done was tell the children. She was not yet ready for that. The situation was still moving, still uncertain in ways she could not fully predict, and she had long ago learned that telling children about possibilities before they became certainties was a particular form of cruelty, because children did not have the emotional architecture to hold a possibility without converting it into an expectation. And disappointed expectations in children left marks that lasted longer than anyone admitted. She would tell them when it was real, when the ground beneath them was solid. On a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after the initial filing, she received a call from Patricia Voss that was different in tone from the others. Patricia said she had been contacted by a representative of a Central European government. The representative had expressed interest in the provenance of the found property and had indicated that his government might have a historical claim to certain imperial treasury assets dispersed before the empire's dissolution. Patricia said the word might with a very particular emphasis. Mara asked what that meant. Patricia said it meant that the claim had not been filed, had not been formally stated, and at present existed only as a politely expressed interest. It meant that someone, somewhere, had seen the declaration and recognized what it described, and had made a call to determine whether Mara could be persuaded to engage on terms favorable to them before the situation became more formally complicated. It was a pressure test, a gentle one, but a test. Mara asked what her options were. Patricia said her options were the same as they had always been. The property and its contents were legally hers. The documentation supporting that ownership was solid. Any claim against it would need to be filed through proper legal channels and would need to establish a direct, documented line from a legitimate successor entity to these specific assets. Given the historical timeline, the dissolution of the empire, the century-plus gap, and the absence of any recorded claim on these specific bars, that was a significant legal burden. Not impossible, but significant. She said, "Be patient. Do not be rushed. Do not respond to informal pressure with informal concessions." Mara thanked her, hung up, and went back to folding the children's laundry which was spread across the bed in the particular organized chaos that laundry always achieved before being fully sorted. She folded her daughter's shirt. She folded her son's. She lined up socks by size. She thought about a treasury official standing in a crypt in 1891 with 11 gold bars and a receipt and a decision to make about what came next. She thought about what it cost to make that decision, what knowledge it required, what risk it carried. She thought about the church above his head, built by people who had come from his empire to a new country with very little and had built something that lasted. She thought about lasting. The formal appraisal report was released to her attorneys the following week. Gerald Okafor had been meticulous. The report ran to 41 pages and addressed provenance, authenticity, metallurgical content, historical significance, and market valuation through 3 different methodological frameworks. The conclusions were stated with the careful restraint of a professional who understood the legal weight of his words and had chosen each one with that understanding in mind. The base valuation for the 11 bars as bullion, based on current gold prices and confirmed purity, was $4.3 million. The historical provenance premium, applied to authenticated imperial treasury pieces with documented chain of origin and the rarity premium associated with unreported reserves, brought the total estimated value to a range between $11 and $17 million, depending on the auction market and the category of buyer. Mara read the report at Patricia Voss's conference table, alone. The door closed. She read it twice. She set it down and looked at the surface of the table and thought about nothing for a while. Just the wood grain. Just the quiet. Then she thought about the woman at the diner in Kellerton who had brought her pie she had not ordered and said that histories in small towns were more complicated than they appeared. She thought that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had said to her in a very long time. Outside the conference room window, the city went about its business with its usual indifference to individual transformation. Cars moved through intersections. A delivery driver navigated a double-parked truck. A woman pushed a stroller past a coffee shop without looking in. None of it registered the shift that had just taken place at a conference table on the 4th floor of an office building, where a woman in a diner uniform, still faintly creased from the morning shift, had just read a number that changed the geometry of her life. Mara pulled out her phone. She did not call anyone. She opened the calculator application and typed in the number at the bottom of the appraiser's range. She sat with it on the screen for a moment. Then she cleared it and typed in the number at the top. She sat with that one too. Then she closed the calculator and put the phone in her pocket. She had known since the crypt that the numbers would be significant. Knowing something and reading it in a 41-page professional report with methodology footnotes were different experiences, but the difference was not in the fact itself. It was in the solidification of the fact. The gold had always been there. The value had always been what it was. What the report had done was remove the last layer of doubt that had been protecting her from the full weight of it. She thanked Patricia and drove home. That evening her sister called again. The warmth in her voice was the same as before, but the weight underneath it had shifted. She had been speaking with some of the cousins. She said, "There is a feeling in the family that something important had happened, and that family should be involved in important things because that was what family was for." She mentioned their aunt, the one who had left the property, Tamara. She said she believed their aunt would have wanted the family to be considered. Mara listened to this. She said she was sure that was true, and that she appreciated the family's interest, and that she would be in touch when there was something concrete to discuss. Her sister said she hoped Mara wasn't going to be difficult about this. Mara said she hoped so too, and said goodnight. She stood in the kitchen after she hung up, the phone still in her hand, looking at the wall that had the water stain from the winter the pipe in the apartment above had leaked, and the landlord had painted over it without fixing the underlying problem, so the stain had come back lighter and stayed. She had looked at that stain so many times over the past years that she no longer saw it most days. Tonight she saw it. She thought about her aunt, the woman she had met twice, who had held the title to a condemned church for years and done nothing with it, who had let it pass through her estate like an afterthought, an inconvenience distributed to the nearest available relative along with $14.61 in back taxes. She thought about whether her aunt had known what was beneath the crypt floor or had simply owned the building on top of it without ever descending the stairs. She thought it was probably the latter. Some things waited a very long time for the right set of circumstances, and the right set of circumstances was rarely planned. It was usually made of small decisions and small refusals, and a willingness to turn around 40 miles from home when every practical instinct said to keep driving. She put the phone down on the counter and went to check on the children. They were both asleep, her daughter with her book still open on the pillow beside her, her son's arm thrown over the edge of the mattress in the particular sprawl of someone who has given themselves entirely to sleep without reservation. She adjusted the book and moved the arm and stood in the doorway for a moment in the dark. Then she went back to the kitchen and opened the drawer beside the stove. She took out the original letter from the county assessor's office, creased and slightly soft from handling. She set it on the table. She set Gerald Okafor's formal report beside it. She set the certified copy of the deed beside that. She looked at the 3 documents side by side. The letter that had started, it was 2 paragraphs and a signature. The deed was a legal form with blanks filled in. The appraisal report was 41 pages of professional caution and precise numbers. Between them, they told a story she had not expected to be part of. She folded the letter back into its original creases and returned it to the drawer. The report and the deed went back into the folder. She poured a glass of water and stood at the window looking at the dark street below, at the cars parked in the orange light, at the building across the way with its few lit windows, people in their own kitchens, running their own arithmetic, carrying their own jars of coins. The next step was the hardest kind, not because it required courage, exactly, but because it required patience in the face of pressure that was only going to increase. The government inquiry was still pending. The family was circling. The journalists were watching the county records. The development company would call again. All of them wanted a piece of something that had waited in silence for over 100 years and had found, quite accidentally, a woman who was too stubborn and too tired to be rushed. She turned off the kitchen light and went to bed. For the first time in as long as she could remember, she slept through the night. The call from Patricia Voss came on a Friday morning while Mara was wiping down tables before the lunch rush. She stepped outside into the narrow strip of sidewalk beside the diner's service entrance, the cloth still in her hand, the smell of coffee and griddle grease following her through the door. Patricia said the government inquiry had been formally filed. The Central European Republic in question had submitted a claim through diplomatic channels, asserting that the bars constituted imperial treasury assets that had been removed without authorization in the years preceding the empire's dissolution, and that as a recognized successor state to a portion of the empire's territory, they maintained a legal interest in their recovery. Mara listened to this without speaking. Patricia said the filing was not unexpected and that it did not alter Mara's position in the ways that mattered most. The claim was broad, referencing categories of asset rather than these specific bars by serial number, which suggested the claimant's documentation was general rather than particular. A general claim was harder to prosecute than a specific one. Patricia had already engaged a specialist in international heritage law who had reviewed the filing and identified several points of significant weakness. She said they were in a good position, but that good positions required defending. Mara asked how much defending would cost. Patricia gave her a number. It was not a small number. It was, however, a number that existed in a different universe from the numbers Mara had been managing for the past several years, because the appraiser's report had established what the hollow beneath the crypt floor contained, and that establishment had changed the arithmetic of everything. She said she would call back within the hour. She went back inside and finished wiping the tables. She refilled the salt shakers and restocked the napkin holders and smiled at the couple who came in at 11:30 and sat at her station and ordered 2 coffees and the lunch special. She carried their plates. She refilled their coffees. She thanked them for the tip, which was generous, and cleared the table with the same efficiency she had applied to every table for the past 4 years. Then she went on her break, sat in the back booth with her phone, and called Patricia back and authorized the legal fees. The process that followed was not dramatic in the way that legal processes are sometimes portrayed. It was slow and technical and conducted almost entirely on paper through filings and responses and requests for documentation and counterfiling that moved at the pace of institutional correspondence, which was to say, slowly. Patricia Voss and the international heritage specialist she had engaged worked methodically, building the case in layers, each one reinforcing the one beneath it. The core of their argument rested on three foundations. The first was ownership. Mara held clear, uncontested title to the property, including all structures and contents, with a documented chain of title that predated the claim by decades. The second was specificity. The claimant could not demonstrate a documented connection between any particular successor state and these specific bars, whose serial numbers appeared on no known recovery list and whose presence at this specific location had been unknown to any official body until Mara's declaration. The third was time, the legal doctrine of laches, which addressed unreasonable delay in asserting a claim, applied with considerable force to a situation in which over a century had passed without any government filing any claim on these assets or demonstrating any knowledge of their location. Patricia explained each element to Mara in language that was clear without being simplified, and Mara absorbed it the way she absorbed most technical information, by asking questions until the framework made sense and then holding the framework steady in her mind while other things moved around it. She was not a lawyer, but she had been managing complicated situations with insufficient resources for long enough to understand the fundamental principle that applied here, which was that a clear, well-documented position, maintained with patience and without unnecessary concession, was more durable than almost anything an opposing party could bring against it. She was patient. The family was not. Her sister called twice more in the weeks following the formal filing, each time with a slightly altered version of the same message. The first call expressed concern that Mara was being isolated, that she was making decisions without the benefit of family perspective, that these things were better handled collectively. The second call was more direct. Their aunt had wanted the family provided for. There were cousins who were struggling. There were people who deserved to be remembered. The implication was not subtle. Mara said she understood. She said she was focused on the legal process and would be in touch when it reached a resolution. She said this with the same steadiness she brought to difficult tables at the diner, the ones where the order was wrong or the wait had been too long and the customer had decided to make it her personal responsibility. You did not argue with those tables. You listened, you acknowledged, and you continued doing your job. Her sister said she hoped Mara remembered who had been there for her during hard times. Mara said she remembered everything. The development company called Patricia's office twice more and was twice declined. A third call came from a different number with a different name, but the same proposal restructured with slightly more attractive terms. Patricia declined that one too and sent a formal letter requesting that all future contact be directed through her office and not to Mara personally. After that, the calls stopped. The journalist from the regional newspaper published a piece that was more accurate than Mara had expected, based on the public records and on background conversations with people in Kellerton who knew the church's history. It described the property, the historical context of the Austro-Hungarian connection, and the legal proceedings in general terms. It did not know the specific value of what had been found, because that information had not been made public. But it was enough to attract attention from larger outlets, and within a week of its publication, 3 national news organizations had made inquiries through Patricia's office. Patricia said the timing of any public statement should be considered carefully. Too early, and it would look like an attempt to influence the legal process. Too late, and the narrative would be shaped by others. She recommended waiting until the claim was formally resolved before making any statement, and even then, keeping the statement simple and brief. Mara said that suited her fine. She had not been seeking attention. She had been seeking resolution. That resolution came on a Wednesday afternoon in the 4th month after the initial filing. Patricia called while Mara was at home, between shifts, with the children at school and the apartment quiet around her. Her voice had a quality Mara had not heard in it before, something contained and professional that was working harder than usual to stay contained. She said the claim had been formally withdrawn. The successor state's legal team had reviewed the full documentation package Patricia's office had compiled and had concluded, apparently with the advice of their own specialists, that the evidentiary basis for pursuing the claim was insufficient to justify the cost and reputational risk of a contested proceeding. They had issued a formal withdrawal, with a brief statement acknowledging the complexity of imperial asset dispersal and expressing no continuing claim on these specific items. It was, Patricia said, as clean a resolution as one could reasonably hope for. Mara sat on the edge of the kitchen chair and looked at the water stain on the wall, the one that had come back lighter after the landlord painted over it. She had looked at that stain so many times. She had calculated rent increases and school supplies and medication co-pays staring at that stain. She had sat at this table in this chair in this kitchen with $43 in checking and a jar of coins on the dresser and a letter from a county assessor's office folded in the drawer, and she had made the decision not to let anyone rush or pass the thing she had found and what it meant. She said, "Thank you." Patricia said there were next steps to discuss, practical ones, involving the formal transfer of the contents from the property, the authentication process for public record, and the engagement of an auction house for those items Mara chose to sell. She said these were not urgent decisions, but they would need to be made. Mara said she understood and asked if they could meet next week. She hung up and sat in the quiet kitchen for a while. Then she got up and washed the 2 cups that were in the sink and dried them and put them in the cabinet. She made a fresh pot of coffee and stood at the window while it brewed, looking at the street. She thought about what she was going to tell the children. She had spent 4 months protecting them from uncertainty, keeping the situation outside the walls of their daily life so that their routines remained intact, so that school and dinner and the bedtime chapter proceeded without the particular anxiety that children absorb from adults who were carrying things they could not put down. She had carried it alone. It had cost her sleep and concentration and more than a few moments of sitting in the car and parking lots breathing through something she did not have a word for. But the carrying was over. The ground was solid now. She could tell them. She picked them up from school that afternoon and took them to the diner. Not because she was working, but because it was their place, the place where they always went when something was worth marking. She let them order what they wanted, which for her daughter was a grilled cheese and a chocolate milkshake, and for her son was pancakes with extra syrup, even though it was 4 in the afternoon. She ordered coffee for herself and sat across from them in the booth and watched them eat and thought about how to begin. She began the way she had always begun difficult things. Plainly, she told them that she had inherited a church from their great-aunt. She told them the church had a crypt beneath it, which made her daughter's eyes go wide in a way that was half alarm and half fascination. She told them that in the crypt she had found something hidden in the floor, something that had been there for a very long time, something that was valuable. She told them that she had found lawyers and experts to help her understand what it meant legally and what it was worth, and that after several months the legal questions had been resolved, and that the something in the floor belonged to them, to their family, free and clear. Her son asked if it was treasure. Mara said yes. It was treasure. Her son considered this with the gravity that 6-year-olds brought to matters they recognized as significant. He asked if they were rich now. Mara said they were going to be okay. She said that for certain. She said the rest they would figure out together. Her daughter asked if she had been scared. Mara thought about that. She thought about the stairs going down into the darkness and the stone in the floor and the drive home with her hands trembling on the wheel and the 4 months of carrying the weight of it alone through shifts and homework and bedtime chapters and phone calls with lawyers and a government claim and a family beginning to circle. She said she had been a little scared sometimes, but mostly she just kept going. Her daughter reached across the table and took her hand and held it with the straightforward, unqualified certainty that children sometimes offered and adults rarely did. Mara held it back. She looked at her children across the table in the late afternoon light, the grilled cheese half eaten, the pancakes mostly gone, the milkshake leaving a ring on the paper placemat. She thought about $14.61. The formal transfer of the content from the crypt took place the following month, coordinated by Patricia's office with the county, the appraiser, and the auction house that had been engaged to handle the sale. Gerald Okafor was present again. The process was documented thoroughly at every stage, each bar inventoried, photographed, and receipted as it left the hollow beneath the floor. Mara was present for all of it. She stood in the crypt with a lantern and watched the work proceed with the same patience she had brought to every other step. When the last piece had been lifted and the hollow was empty, She stood at the far wall for a moment and looked down at it. The plastered interior was pale in the lantern light, smooth and dry, undamaged by the century it had spent sealed. The craftsmanship was still visible, the care of the hands that had built it. She thought about the treasury official and the deacon and the receipt written in 2 languages and the decision they had made together to place something inside this wall and trust the stone to keep it. She thought about trust and what it required and how long it could hold when the thing it was asked to hold was heavy enough. She climbed the stairs one last time, walked through the vestibule, and stood in the churchyard in the thin winter light. The grass had been cut at some point in the fall by someone she had hired from Kellerton, and the rise in front of the church looked tidier than it had on her first visit. The boarded windows were the same. The chain on the door was the same. The steeple still leaned at its particular angle. She had been asked, more than once in the preceding months, what she planned to do with the property. The auction house had offered to include it in a real estate segment. The development company had made one final, unsolicited offer through an intermediary. A historical preservation organization had expressed interest in taking the structure under its protection. She had not decided yet. She did not feel the need to decide quickly. The church had waited over 100 years. It could wait a little longer while she thought about what it deserved. The auction was scheduled for spring, conducted through a specialist house with established relationships in the European historical collectibles market. The 11 bars were presented as a collection, with Gerald Okafor's 41-page report as the anchor document and the translated receipt from the county records office as supporting provenance. The pre-auction estimates, published in the house's catalog, reflected both the bullion value and the historical premium, and they attracted the attention the specialist had predicted. Mara did not attend the auction in person. She was working a split shift that day and had decided some weeks earlier that she did not want to sit in a room and watch numbers climb. She found the distance appropriate. She had done the work. She had found the thing, protected it, authenticated it, and brought it to the point where its value could be properly recognized. What happened in that room was the market's business, not hers. Patricia called her during her afternoon break. Her voice had the same contained quality it had carried on the day of the withdrawal, working harder than usual. The collection had sold. The final price was just over $14 million before fees and taxes. Mara was sitting in her car in the diner's parking lot. The afternoon was gray and cold, the sky the color of old concrete. She heard the number and said nothing for a moment. Then she asked Patricia to repeat it. Patricia did. The number was the same. She thanked her and sat in the car for a while. A delivery truck pulled in next to her, and the driver got out and went around to the back and began unloading cases with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had done the same thing 1,000 times. She watched him for a moment. She thought about the 1,000 times. After fees, legal costs, and taxes, the amount that transferred to the account Patricia had helped her establish was just over $9 million. It arrived in the account on a Thursday morning, confirmed by a notification on her phone while she was making the children's lunches. She showed her daughter the notification. Her daughter read it and looked up at her and said nothing, which was exactly right. The first thing Mara did was pay the rent. Not the 4 weeks she had owed at the old rate. She paid the lease in full through its expiration date, which was 3 months away, and then she began looking for a different apartment, one without mold in the walls, in a neighborhood where her son's cough might resolve itself simply by breathing the air. The second thing she did was call her daughter's eye doctor and schedule the follow-up appointment that had been delayed twice for financial reasons. The third thing she did was transfer a sum to her son's name and her daughter's name into accounts she set up with Patricia's guidance, structured to grow over the years between now and the future she intended them to have. College. Options. The particular freedom that came from not having to make choices based solely on what was available rather than what was right. She did not do any of these things dramatically. There was no moment of visible triumph, no speech, no photograph taken for posterity. She made the calls and the transfers in the same steady way she had always managed the numbers, with attention and without ceremony, because the quality that had gotten her here was not passion or luck, but the refusal to treat any task as beneath careful attention. She did eventually respond to her sister. She waited until the apartment move, was underway and the children were settled in their new routines before she called. Her sister answered with a warmth that was genuine, Mara thought, even if it was complicated. Mara told her that the legal process had concluded successfully and that she was in a position to help the family in a measured way, and that she intended to do so on terms that she would determine with her own legal counsel, and that would be clear and documented and fair. Her sister said that was wonderful and that she had always known Mara would come through for the family. Mara said she was sure that was right. She said she would be in touch. She set the phone down and looked at the wall of the new apartment, which was clean and dry and unmarked by any previous disaster. She had chosen it partly for that reason. She wanted walls that had nothing to overcome. The news of the auction had made its way into public coverage by then, the regional story that had been building for months, now having the numbers it needed to become complete. Headlines described the find in terms that tended toward the superlative: a single mother, a condemned church, forgotten imperial gold, $14 million. The framing was not wrong exactly, but it moved through the story at a speed that flattened the texture of it, that made it sound like a sequence of events that followed inevitably from each other rather than the thing it actually was, which was a long chain of small decisions made under pressure by a person who was too tired to be anything other than clear about what mattered. People from the diner recognized her. Some customers asked about it directly, and she answered briefly and without drama. The manager gave her a raise she had not asked for. She thanked him and worked out her remaining shifts and gave her notice at the end of the month. She did it on a Friday and drove home in the afternoon traffic and felt, somewhere around the third intersection, the specific release that comes when something you have been holding for a very long time is set down somewhere solid and does not need to be picked up again. The woman from the diner in Kellerton, the one who had brought her pie without being asked, sent a card. Mara did not know how she had found the address. The card said simply that she had known the church had been waiting for someone with the sense to look at it properly, and that she was glad it had been Mara. She had enclosed, tucked into the card, a photocopy of a newspaper clipping from the Kellerton Courier dated 1962, which showed a photograph of the church on its centennial. The congregation gathered outside in their good clothes, the stone walls behind them solid and certain, the steeple casting its particular shadow over the assembled faces. Mara looked at the photograph for a long time. She looked at the building in the background, the one that had been condemned when she inherited it, that had cost $14.61 to claim, that had a crypt beneath it with a hollow in the floor, and inside that hollow a century's worth of waiting, patient and sealed against the years. She tacked the photograph to the wall above her kitchen table. She had made a decision about the church. She did not announce it publicly. She communicated it to Patricia, who handled the paperwork, and to the historical preservation organization that had expressed interest, who received the news with a formality that did not quite conceal their pleasure. She donated the property to the organization under a deed of gift that included a set of conditions she had drafted herself, with Patricia's input, specifying that the building was to be restored rather than altered, that the crypt was to be preserved as a historical space open to documented descendants of the families interred there, and that a permanent interpretive display would acknowledge the history of the community that had built the church and the role of the structure in the broader story of imperial asset dispersal during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. She also specified, in a paragraph that Patricia had reviewed and approved, that the display would note the manner in which the property had been acquired and by whom, not because Mara wanted recognition in any formal sense, but because she believed that the complete story of the place deserved to be told, which meant including the part about who had finally looked at it properly. On the day the deed of gift was signed and witnessed and filed, she drove to Kellerton one last time. She parked at the base of the rise and walked up through the grass, which was beginning to show the first green of early spring beneath the dry stalks of the previous year. She walked around the perimeter of the building the way she had on her first visit, one hand occasionally touching the stone wall, feeling its cool solidity. She went around to the rear, through the vestibule, down the 12 worn stairs. The crypt was empty of the bars now, the hollow sealed with new mortar that matched the old stone better than her pry bar work had managed. The alcoves held their sealed boxes in the same patient silence. The vaulted ceiling rose to its apex in the steady lantern light. She stood in the center of the room for a while. She was not waiting for anything. She was not looking for anything further. She was simply being in the space that had changed the direction of her life without any intention of doing so, that had simply been what it was and had waited until someone arrived who was willing to pay attention. She thought about the children. She thought about her daughter's new glasses and her son's cleared lungs in the clean apartment and the accounts that would grow over the years into something they could build from. She thought about the shifts at the diner and the arithmetic that never balanced and the jar of coins on the dresser she had finally counted, which had totaled $11.40, which she had used to buy the children ice cream on Sunday afternoon because she had decided that was exactly what $11.40 was for. She thought about $14.61 and what it had purchased. She turned off the lantern and stood in the complete darkness for a moment. The same darkness she had stood in on her first descent when the air had pressed against her face like a hand, not pushing but present. It was still the same air, still cold, still carrying the mineral weight of old stone and sealed years. Then she climbed the stairs into the spring light and closed the door behind her. The church stood on its rise as it had always stood, patient and solid against the flatness of the sky. The steeple leaned at its angle. The boarded windows faced the road. The stone walls held the morning with the particular indifference of things built to outlast the specific concerns of any individual generation. Mara walked to her car. She sat for a moment with the keys in her hand. She thought about the drive home, about the highway and the flat country and the landscape changing from open to populated as the city approached, about the apartment with clean walls waiting and two children in school who would come home in the afternoon wanting to tell her about their days, and she would be there unhurried, unrushed, without the arithmetic running constantly in the background, without the jar of coins, without the notices in the drawer. She would be simply there. She started the car and drove down the rise and through Kellerton and out onto the road that became the highway. The morning opened around her, wide and clear, the sky the uncomplicated blue of early spring that promised nothing except continuance, which was enough. She drove with the window down despite the cold, her left arm resting on the door, feeling the air move past her hand. She did not look back. The condemned church was behind her now, with its crypt and its empty hollow and its walls that had held a secret for over 100 years, until a woman who was too tired to be rushed arrived on a Saturday morning with a thermos of coffee and a pry bar, and the particular quality of attention that comes from having nothing left to lose and everything still to find. The road went on. The sky went on. The world went on in its indifferent and generous way, full of things hidden in plain sight, full of stones with crisp edges and floors full of worn ones, full of receipts written in 2 languages and folders no one has opened in decades, full of opportunities disguised as burdens, full of $14 inheritances that contain within them. If you are willing to descend the stairs and carry the weight and wait without flinching for the ground to become solid, everything that was ever needed. The morning was clear. The drive was long, and Mara was not in any hurry at all. In the weeks that followed, the world did not stop asking questions simply because she had stopped needing to answer them urgently. That was the thing no one told you about the end of a long period of financial pressure. The habits of that pressure did not dissolve on the same schedule as the conditions that had created them. She still woke at 5 in the morning. She still inventoried the refrigerator before she made a grocery list. She still caught herself calculating tips before the check arrived at a restaurant table. Not because the amount mattered anymore in the way it once had, but because the calculation was wired into her the way the reflex to brace before impact was wired in, a response that had been earned through repetition and did not unknow itself simply because the impact had stopped coming. Patricia Voss had recommended a financial advisor, a woman named Sylvie who worked with clients navigating significant and sudden changes in financial circumstance. Mara had been skeptical at first, not of the advice itself, but of the category of person who needed it. She had spent so many years being the person who made do without professional guidance on money because professional guidance cost money. She did not have that the idea of sitting across from someone whose job was to help her manage an abundance felt like a transaction belonging to someone else's life. She went anyway. Sylvie was practical and unimpressed by numbers in the way that people who worked with numbers daily became. And she asked Mara questions that no one had ever asked her before, because no one had ever had reason to. What did she want her life to look like in 10 years? Not financially, but actually, where did she want to live? What did she want the children to be able to choose? What had she not allowed herself to want, because wanting it had seemed like a form of irresponsibility? Mara thought about the last question for longer than she expected. She had spent so many years in the discipline of not wanting things she could not have that the discipline had become the structure of her thinking. The arithmetic had always been about subtraction and management, about which thing could wait and which thing could not, about the minimum viable version of each necessity. The idea of addition, of genuine addition without a corresponding loss somewhere else in the column, required a different kind of thinking that she was still learning to do. It was not unpleasant learning. It was simply unfamiliar, the way a muscle in use for a long time was unfamiliar when you finally asked it to work. She told Sylvie she wanted a house. Not a large one, not an impressive one. One with a yard where her son could run without negotiating concrete, and a room where her daughter could read without hearing the neighbor's television through the wall, and a kitchen with enough counter space to actually cook rather than to manage the logistics of cooking in a space designed for neither comfort nor ambition. Sylvie wrote it down and said that was a reasonable starting point. The house search took 3 months, which Mara did not rush. She had learned, over the preceding year, that rushing was the enemy of the right outcome, and that patience was not passivity, but a form of active attention applied to a longer timeline. She looked at houses the way she had looked at the Crypt, methodically, without projecting onto them, assessing what was actually present rather than what she hoped was there. She found an early summer. It was not remarkable from the outside, a 2-story house on a quiet street in a neighborhood that was neither fashionable nor declining, simply inhabitable in the honest, unglamorous way that good neighborhoods were. It had the yard. It had the room. It had the kitchen with the counter space. It had a basement that was dry and a roof that was sound and walls that contained no evidence of problems painted over without resolution. She bought it with a directness that still surprised her when she thought about it later, writing the check without drama the way she had once written checks for electricity bills and rent, because money spent on the right thing was simply the correct application of a resource, regardless of the number attached. Her son ran the length of the backyard on the first afternoon and came back to her out of breath and said it was the best yard he had ever been in, which it was because it was the first yard he had ever been in. She stood on the back step watching him and felt something she did not immediately have a name for, something warm and quiet that was neither happiness in the sharp sense nor relief in the relieved sense, but the specific feeling of having arrived somewhere she had been moving toward for a very long time without knowing it was the destination. Her daughter found her room and spent the first evening arranging her books on the shelves Mara had bought from a furniture store without calculating whether she could afford them, because she could, and walked out afterward and said it looked exactly right. Mara agreed. It did. The diner on the old street sent her a card signed by the morning shift staff, which she appreciated more than the gesture required. She had worked alongside those people through the specific intimacy that came from shared labor in a small space, and they had never asked her for more than she had to give and had offered what they could when they had it, which was not nothing. She framed the card and put it in the kitchen of the new house because she believed that where you had come from deserved to be visible from where you had arrived. The children settled into new schools in September with the adaptability that children demonstrated when the conditions supporting their lives were stable. Her son's cough did not return. Her daughter's grades were the same as they had always been, which was to say excellent, because that had never been about resources but about the particular quality of attention she brought to everything she decided mattered. Mara watched them move through the new rhythms of the new year and felt the arithmetic in her head quieting, not disappearing, but receding to a level that no longer required constant management. It became background rather than foreground. It became what it was supposed to be. She was not idle. She had never been idle and did not intend to start. She had begun working with Patricia's office on a foundation, small and deliberately structured, focused on property access and legal support for people navigating inheritance situations involving neglected or contested assets. The work was technical and slow and required the same patience she had applied to her own situation, which suited her. She understood the landscape from the inside, and that understanding was worth more than any amount of secondhand expertise. The foundation was not named after her. She had resisted that suggestion from 3 separate sources and had won that resistance without difficulty because she did not need the building to carry her name to know that she had built it. What mattered was what it did, not what it was called. She had learned that lesson in a crypt in a condemned church, where the thing that had lasted was not the name above the door but the stone beneath the floor, and the care with which the important things had been placed inside it. In October, she received a letter from the Historical Preservation Organization that had accepted the church. They were beginning the restoration process and wanted to consult with her about several decisions, including the interpretive display she had specified in the deed of gift. They enclosed preliminary design sketches for her review and asked if she would be willing to visit the site during the early phase of work. She drove to Kellerton on a Saturday morning that was cold and bright, the kind of autumn morning that was honest about the season without being apologetic about it. She arrived before the preservation team and stood on the rise outside the church in the same position she had stood on her first visit, looking up at the stone walls, the boarded windows, the leaning steeple. She had been asked, in several interviews conducted in the months since the auction, what it had felt like to stand in front of the church for the first time and know she owned it. She had given various versions of the truthful answer, which was that she had not known she owned it in any meaningful sense until she was willing to go inside, and that ownership without attention was just a word on a piece of paper. The church had not belonged to her because the deed said so. It had belonged to her because she had descended the stairs. The preservation team arrived in 2 vehicles and proceeded with the organized efficiency of people who worked on old buildings for reasons beyond the practical. They moved through the space with a respect that Mara recognized and appreciated, touching things carefully, speaking in measured tones, treating the structure as something that deserved to be understood before it was altered. She walked with the lead architect through the nave, which was cold and dim but structurally sound in every wall, and through the vestibule, and down the 12 worn stairs. In the crypt, the architect spent a long time looking at the alcoves and the sealed stone boxes and the vaulted ceiling before she said anything. When she spoke, she said the space was remarkable, not because of what had been found there, though that was remarkable too, but because of the quality of the construction, the care that had been brought to a space most people would never see. She said that kind of care was its own form of intention, that people who built hidden spaces with that level of attention were making a statement about what deserved to endure. Mara stood at the far wall and looked at the hollow, now sealed with new mortar in the same pale stone. She thought about the treasury official and the deacon and the receipt written in 2 languages. She thought about what they had believed when they placed those bars in the hollow, what they had expected the future to look like, whether they had imagined someone finding them or imagined the finding was not the point and the keeping was. She thought about the patience of stone, which did not know it was being patient because it did not know the alternative. She said she was glad the building was going to be restored. The architect said she was glad someone had found it who understood what it was. They climbed the stairs together and stood in the vestibule while the team continued their documentation work. Outside, through the narrow high window, the autumn sky was exactly the blue it had been on the morning Mara had first pushed that swollen wooden door open with her shoulder and stepped into the smell of earth and something older beneath it. She had not known then what she was stepping into. She had known only that the stone beneath her feet was cold and that the air was heavy and that somewhere below her was a question worth asking. That had been enough. It had always been enough. The willingness to ask and then to sit with the answer long enough to understand it, and then to protect what you had found until the ground was solid enough to stand on. She left Kellerton in the early afternoon and drove home through the changing light with the radio on low and the window cracked the way she liked it. The cool air moving through the car with the quiet persistence of things that had been doing what they did long before anyone was paying attention and would continue long after. She pulled into the driveway of the house on the quiet street, the house with the yard and the room and the counter space, and sat for a moment with the engine off before going inside. The afternoon was still and bright. A neighbor 2 houses down was raking leaves with the unhurried focus of someone who had nowhere else to be. A dog moved along the sidewalk with its owner, nose to the ground, absorbed in a world of information invisible to everyone but itself. She went inside. She put her bag down. She looked at the diner card in its frame on the kitchen wall, the signatures of the morning shift staff in their various handwritings, the small, ordinary record of a time that had required more of her than it should have, and had produced, in the requiring, something she could not have built any other way. She started dinner. The children would be home in an hour. She thought about the hollow in the floor of the crypt, empty now, sealed with pale mortar, its long patience finally concluded. She thought about what it meant to hold something valuable in darkness and silence, neither losing it nor releasing it, waiting for the moment when the conditions for the right handling had arrived. She thought about how easily the moment could be missed, how many people had walked above that hollow without descending the stairs, how many years had passed between the placing and the finding. She thought about the $14.61, not with nostalgia, not with the sentimental attachment people sometimes developed toward the instruments of their transformation, but with the clear-eyed recognition that it had been a real amount paid for a real thing, and that the real thing had been worth the paying, not because of what was inside it, which she could not have known, but because it had been the right decision to go and look, and the right decision to go back, and the right decision to be patient, and the right decision to be careful, and the right decision to trust that the ground would become solid if you gave it enough time and did the work that the moment required. The children came through the door with the particular energy of people who had spent the day in the world and were returning to a place that received them completely. Her son dropped his backpack in the hallway, and her daughter set hers by the stairs with the precision that was already her nature, and they both came to the kitchen and leaned against the counter and began telling her about their days, both at once, their voices overlapping in the way that she had never wanted to untangle, because the overlap was itself a kind of music, the specific sound of a household that was not managing but simply living. She listened and stirred, and asked questions and listened more. The kitchen smelled of dinner, and the late afternoon light came through the window at the angle it always came through at this hour, falling across the counter in a warm band that moved slowly as the sun descended. The diner card was on the wall. The photograph from the Kellerton Courier was above the table. The house was quiet around the sound of her children and the sound of the meal being made, and the sound of an ordinary evening proceeding in an ordinary way, which was the least ordinary thing she could imagine, because she had known for long enough what its absence cost to understand precisely what its presence was worth. She did not think about the crypt again that evening. She did not think about the gold, or the government claim, or the auction, or the numbers. She thought about what was in front of her, which was everything she had needed and more than she had allowed herself to want. Arrived through a door she had opened in the dark with nothing but a pry bar and the refusal to be anyone other than herself. That was enough. It had always been enough. It was more than enough now. And outside, the evening settled over the quiet street and the yard where her son had run until he was breathless, and the sky went through its colors the way it always did, indifferent and faithful, keeping its own kind of account. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.